Welcome back, 3D students. In this video, we're going to create objects called helpers, which allow us to bind our control objects to the bones. The bones are set up in a hierarchy, such that when we rotate one, the ones above it follow. And this is the parent-child relationship that I've told you about. If we were to try to directly link our control objects to the bones, then we would interrupt their hierarchy. So what we need to do is attach or constrain each bone to a helper object and then link our control object to the helper object. And this is not necessary in some 3D programs such as Maya, but it is necessary in 3D Max. So to create helpers, we need to come up to the Create tab and find the Helpers button, which is right here. And what we're going to create is a point helper. So click Point and just click anywhere in your scene. And it creates this kind of little crosshair thing. And let's go to the Modify tab, and let's add a box to our helper to make it a little easier to see. You can also select your helper, and in the parameters here, you can change its size. You can also add a tripod to it, which shows its axis of rotation. And you can add a center marker, which shows its center. But I don't think we need either one of those. So now what we need to do is align our helper object with the bone joint right here. And it needs to be aligned exactly. So to do that, we're going to use the Align tool. So select your control object and come up here to the toolbar and click this button right here, Align. And then click this second bone. And that aligns the bone however we want it to. We want to align by pivot point. And we want to align the X, Y, and Z position. And we also want to align the X, Y, and Z rotation. This is very important. You have to check this. And then click OK. And let's go ahead and name this controller. Let's name it PTCTRL for point control, spine 01. Or I'm sorry, tail 01. And then let's copy that name. And we're going to hold down Shift and copy this controller. Click OK. And then we could push this button here again, but there's a shortcut for the Align tool, and it is Alt-A. So again, you can either push this button and see it's activated now, or you can use Alt-A on your keyboard and click that third button. Everything that we checked before is still active, so we're just going to click OK. And we need to change this. Oh, look, it's already changed. How about that? But I'm going to delete one of those zeros. And let's copy this again. Alt-A for Align. And click the last button. Make sure all of this is checked. X, Y, and Z position, pivot point, X, Y, and Z rotation. Click OK. So before we go any further, we need to do something to these controllers that we've created. If we click one of them and we go to the Motion tab right here in your command panel, select Position here, you will see that there is a number in there. If we click Rotation, you'll see the same thing. There's a number. We don't want there to be any data in here. So what we're going to do is select all three of these controllers, and we're going to hold down Alt and right click, and that brings up the rigging quad menu, and we're going to freeze the transformations. And what that does is that zeroes out that data. And you can see clearly here, there is no data here, and there is no data here. We have zeroed out the transformations of these objects. And we need to do that because once we start constraining things and linking things, we may have residual data in there, and as we move them, they will not behave properly. So the next thing we need to do is constrain each bone to its helper object. So let's select this bone, and let's go up to Animation and find Constraints. And you can see here there are a number of different types of constraints. What we want is the orientation constraint, and that has to do with rotation. So with the bone selected, click orientation constraint, and you'll see this little dotted line, and you're going to constrain that to the helper. So now what happens is when we rotate the helper, it rotates our bone. But when we move the helper, it doesn't do anything. An orientation constraint is different than a position constraint. So let's click the next bone, go to animation, and look at constraints again. We have different types of constraints. As I said, we have a position constraint, which would constrain the movement of the object. We have a path constraint, which would constrain an object to a path. We have a surface constraint, which would constrain the object to the surface of a mesh. We have an attachment constraint, which would temporarily attach an object to another. And we have a link constraint, which could also temporarily link one object to another. And these can be turned on and off and animated, and that's why we would use these. And then we have a look at constraint, which keeps an object looking at another moving object. So we're going to use an orientation constraint again, which has to do with rotation, as I said. So click that one, and then click the helper object. And then let's do the last bone. Animation, constraints, orientation constraint. And click that. And then let's check each one of them. You can see that behaves weirdly. There's a reason for that. So before we leave, let's create a layer for our helper objects. Let's select all three of them and go to the layers menu here. Make sure you're in layer view and click the plus sign. And we're going to name these helpers. And remember to make the default layer active again. So when we come back, we're going to create the control objects and link everything up and test it out. And I'll see you then.